Welcome to our YouTube video series on employment law. My name is Christopher Neufeld, the Neufeld Legal. And in this particular video, we were going to be looking at Mark Zuckerberg's layoff letter to his employees at Meta, which is a parent company for Facebook, from an employment lawyer's perspective, and making some assessments as to what is contained in it, why it might be done this way, why other employers might consider this, but also why many employers would not consider taking this approach. So let's delve directly into the letter itself and go over it and understand the background that's being put forward. Now, he starts off by saying, "Today I'm sharing some of the most difficult changes we've made in Meta's history. I've decided to reduce the size of our team by about 13%. And let more than 11,000 of our talented employees go. We are also taking a number of additional steps to become a leaner and more efficient company by cutting discretionary spending and extending our hiring freeze through Q1. Now, what's important to notice is that the sheer number of employees that are being let go, we're talking about 11,000 employees, such that what he's trying to do is personalize it a bit. Because what is happening is it's such a voluminous amount of people. 13% of the company, representing over 10,000 people, are being let go from a company. And so he's trying to put into perspective as to what is taking place. And this is an important thing, an important consideration, because very rarely do you see most companies taking that large of a cut in the amount of employees that they're slashing off. 13%, 11,000 employees, that is considerable. And that is going to frame a lot of perspective into what is contained in the letter. Next, he goes on to say, "I want to take accountability for these decisions and for how we got here. I know this is tough for everyone, and I'm especially sorry to those impacted." Now, that is a lot to say and is not typical in an employment termination situation. In fact, what happens is employers tend to refrain from providing any responsibility, any semblance of what they're doing, but instead allowing it to be this great black hole that people typically see. Now, one of the reasons they do this is because a lot of this stuff could be taken back by way of litigation if the employee feels that they're getting underpaid by way of severance. And what this means is that you better be giving a very good and generous severance package to those terminated employees if you're going to say you're taking accountability and you're going to expound upon what your rationale for laying off people is, because this material could very well become part of court litigation from disgruntled employees who fight back against the company. So what needs to be done is, if you're going to say this, you better have your ducks in order. You better have exceeded what the standards are for employee severance pay. So then he goes on to explain how they got into this position, which is interesting in that it's known, but it's also typically, as we said before, you don't get these kind of explanations. How do we get here? At the start of COVID, the world rapidly moved online, and the surge of e-commerce led to outsized revenue growth. Many people predicted this would be a permanent acceleration that would continue even after the pandemic ended. I did too. So I made decisions to significantly increase our investments. Unfortunately, this did not play out the way I expected. Not only has online commerce returned to prior trends, but the macroeconomic downturn, increased competition, and ads signal loss have caused our revenue to be much lower than I'd expected. I got this wrong, and I take responsibility for that. A perfectly legitimate business decision that's being outlined right here, in that they tried to grow the business even further. It didn't work. Had to make the necessary decisions to let go of people because you have to cut back. It's nothing to do with the individual. it more has to do with the business. And look at the scale and sheer size of this business. It's excessive. And you also have to remember, it has to report back to its ownership. And its ownership is publicly traded company, meaning major investors and shareholders who have a say in this. So that's what their expectation was. That's what the recommendation was from the investment banking community, from the legal community, the accounting community, so on and so forth. Going on. In this new environment, we need to become more capital efficient. We've shifted more of our resources onto a smaller number of high priority growth areas, like our AI discovery engine, our ads and business platforms, and our long-term vision for the metaverse. We've cut costs across our business, including scaling back budgets, reducing perks, and shrinking our real estate footprint. We're restructuring teams to increase our efficiency, but these measures alone won't bring our expenses in line with our revenue growth. So I've also made the hard decision to let people go. So once again, what we see is it is not a singular action. It is a multiplicity of actions that are being done. Naturally, the one that impacts employees is the most is the fact that many employees are being let go and there's being constrictions undertaken. Now we get into the meat and potatoes. How will this work? There is no good way to do a layoff, but we hope to get all the relevant information to you as quickly as possible and then do whatever we can to support you through this. Now, once again, what we're talking about is 11,000 layoffs. 13% of the company's employee base is being let go. So you want to get ahead of it to the extent possible, and that is what they're doing. And then you have to move it forward. Challenging with so many people such that it has a lack of being personal, but it's necessary. Something that you wouldn't necessarily approach with in a smaller company, which is seen as entirely inappropriate. But when you're talking about 11,000 people, it's going to be blasted over the media. You don't want people to be worried about it, speculating about too much when it's actually coming down. You may as well just get it moved forward. So how do they go about doing it? Everyone will get an email soon letting you know what this layoff means for you. After that, every affected employee will have the opportunity to speak with someone to get their questions answered and join information sessions. So here we see how quickly they want to move forward to get people informed. What is particularly interesting, and this is something that you don't see entirely too often, is that they're saying that you're going to have your questions answered now in their information sessions. This is naturally a large part of it being such a large layoff because it's not typical for a lot of questions to be necessarily answered. What questions will be answered, that's another question entirely. Typically, the people who are doing the layoffs on a smaller scale are very well instructed and trained to minimize the amount of information that is communicated. And that's as a matter of course. So in this situation, given the fact that, as we'll see, the expectation is that they're providing large enough packages that people will not be fighting legally with them afterwards, one could anticipate that they could be more open about questions and assistance. So we go on. Some of the details in the United States include severance. We will pay 16 weeks of base pay plus 2 additional weeks per year of service with no cap. Now, as we see right away, they are going over and above. such that somebody who's worked there for only 2 years and might be just out of university would be entitled to a minimum of 20 weeks of base pay, which is considerable. Now, this is probably a minimum that they're providing, because you know that they've talked to lawyers and they've reviewed this full well, that there are certain circumstances where they've brought in high-end people for whom even 16 weeks plus the additional 2 weeks per year service are not going to be viewed as adequate, because they left a very high and prestigious job and they've given that up for this. So this, in most likelihood, is a baseline minimum, but a very high baseline. Pay time off. We will pay for all remaining pay time off time. Important because it's one of the things that people often think about. It's viewed as, in the United States, as something that's been earned and one's entitled to. And you want to cut off any worries about this, including potential class action litigation, which is a legitimate consideration in these circumstances, given how broad it is. It's something class action lawyers would be looking at, nuanced parts, because if you weren't doing paid time off, you've got a class of 11,000 people potentially. RSU vesting. This is your shares, stock in the company. Everyone impacted will receive their November 15, 2022 vesting. So this is another important area of concern for people, because people like to get their shares even though the shares had fallen in value previously. One of the major incentives with technology companies is the shares. And oftentimes stuff is written up in a way to keep people entrenched in the business and to not have people walk away, such that they need to be there for a period of time. So what they're doing is they're ensuring vesting occurs and people get their shares. Health insurance. Cover the cost of healthcare for people and their families for 6 months. Another important consideration, not the biggest cost to them, but important for and perception to those people who are being let go, especially in a system like the United States, where private healthcare is so important. You need time to transition, whether to a new job or to a new healthcare program, if you don't find that job. So you don't want to be left out there, especially where you are under significant healthcare needs. Also, the thing is, this is a point for discussion, most likely with Facebook, that if there is a bigger need to have continuing healthcare, considering how they're approaching stuff, that could be provided. Career services. This is a very common aspect nowadays and is an important factor to transition people forward. So here they say, career services will provide 3 months of career support with an external vendor, including easy access to unpublished job leads. Now, this is important to trying to accelerate people's confidence in moving forward with these opportunities. Sometimes I question how much terminated employees take advantage of these systems and how good these systems are, but it's something that should be looked into. Immigration support. I know this is especially difficult if you're here on a visa. There's a notice period before termination and some visa grace periods, which means everyone will have time to make plans and work through their immigration status. We have dedicated immigration specialists to help guide you based on what you and your family need. Now, this is something that is not seen necessarily, but then maybe it's because I don't see a lot of H-1B visa or other immigrant status individuals in my own practice, because I'm not practicing in Silicon Valley. Nevertheless, it is an important consideration to set up, because another area of extreme anxiety tied into the career services aspect that you would very much want to overcome and actually communicate that going forward, because especially in the tech field, there's going to be a tendency to bring ever more, in my opinion, immigrants or overseas visa applicants to work in your tech business. Outside the US, support will be similar and will follow up soon with separate processes that take into account local employment laws. Now, this is an important consideration, considering that in Canada, you have different rules with respect to severance, with respect to mass layoffs, and other aspects like that. So that those things are going to be considered, and you have to make that clear, and you have to follow up on that. We made the decision to remove access to most Meta systems for people leaving today, given the amount of access to sensitive information. But we're keeping email addresses active throughout the day so everyone can say farewell. So now you see that where the cutbacks immediately are implemented. You're allowed access to email for maybe sending out emails, getting some emails back. Nevertheless, what we always suggest, in a very cautious and careful manner, understanding, monitoring, and tracking of these large companies, is that when there is a pending layoff coming, especially this was known to be a possibility, that there's a lot of information that all too often is supposed to be personal information to yourself, that in fact you have sent to your business email just because you're so heavily inundated with the business. You want to be shifting that personal information to your own records. You want to have copies of it. So we're talking about employment contracts, pay statements, citations, awards, references, things like that. Things that were meant to be specifically yours. They were issued by the company to you in your personal capacity as an employee, and not as in your capacity of working for the employer and being employment data. It is, employer data, employer information. It is personal information that you use for processing stuff, doing your taxes, doing your finances. But what you have to be doing, and we say this over and over again, is this material should be taken offline, because as you see, your access is being cut off. And that is a crucial consideration. Makes it very difficult, especially where there is the potential for litigation, or there's an effort to make an assessment as to your situation. A lack of information can be highly problematic. While we're making reductions in every organization across both Family of Apps and Reality Labs, some teams will be affected more than others. Naturally, this is to be anticipated, in that there is the challenges of some divisions which overgrew, such that it's not even personal performance that is dictating stuff. It is entire departments, divisions, sections that could be pushed away. Recruiting will be disproportionately effective, since we're planning to hire fewer people next year. We're also restructuring our business teams more substantially. This is not a reflection of the great work these team groups have done, but what we need going forward. The leaders of each group will schedule time to discuss what this means for your team over the next couple of days. Once again, talking about what the approach is. engagement, something that is all too often missing, but is a reality of a large company such as Facebook. The teammates who will be leaving us are talented and passionate and have made an important impact on our company and community. Each of you have helped make Meta a success, and I'm grateful for it. I'm sure you're going to go on to do great work at other places. Here again, another powerful closing statement, something that you can do when you're offering enough in the way of severance and the legal team has covered their bases. What other changes are we making? I view layoffs as a last resort, so we decided to rein in other sources of costs before letting teammates go. Overall, this will add up to a meaningful cultural shift in how we operate. For example, as we shrink our real estate footprint, we're transitioning to desk sharing for people who already spend most of their time outside the office. We'll roll out more cost-cutting changes like this in the coming months. Very interesting from the perspective of where employment is going and what the expectations will be. Now, the balance of the memo, as one would see, is to describe to the remaining employees what other actions are being undertaken and how those actions interrelate with the layoffs. We won't necessarily go into that part because it doesn't provide us with that much more analysis other than to go to the conclusion where Mark Zuckerberg wraps it up saying, "We'll share more on how we'll operate as a streamlined organization to achieve our priorities in the weeks ahead." So right away they're talking about how they're focusing on making the company more, narrowing it down, streamlining it, making it more efficient, and purging out that 13% of the employees. For now, I'll say one more time how thankful I am to those who are leaving for everything you've done to advance our mission, Mark. And as such, he ends off by doing that final personal acknowledgement that he couldn't do personally or individually to 11,000 people. And at the same time, tries to give that personal feel, which is something he can do simply because they've gone what would appear to be over and above with respect to the packages that they've offered up. And that is critical to understand in that unless you're prepared to make that sacrifice, so to speak, and pay the larger severance, you're not going to be able to provide this kind of memo letter expression to the employers. Thank you.